I'm Vic Lane with the Grand Traverse Regional Land Conservancy. One of the recent projects I've been working on is pollinator habitat work. Today we're going to talk about pollinator habitat, the benefits of pollinators for wildlife, for biodiversity, but also for farming. And I'm going to show you around this pollinator planting, and we can talk about a few things as we go. Here are a couple of species. Here's a purple coneflower. This one is not native specifically to our area, but in southern Michigan, and does add diversity and I guess a little bit of color, unique color too, to the pollinator habitat. And we know that insects are attracted by different colors. So that diversity is great. We also have in here an Evening-Primrose coming up. That one's almost 6 foot tall, probably 5.5 feet tall there. And then we have mullein. Now, there's also, I think to mention, it's really important to talk a little bit about non-native vegetation. Someone just recently asked me, well, aren't invasive flowers, aren't non-native flowers, don't they also serve an ecological purpose? And I think the answer to that is, of course they do. So a non-native like this mullein, for example, a woodpecker may find use in those seeds. We were just watching one sitting here pecking on this mullein. We have pokeweed and some other plants, and of course they serve purposes ecologically too. But when we're trying to establish a habitat, we want a suite of species that are known to work well together. We also want ones that are native to our site and will persist here over time, so we're planting perennial species. And so you'll see some of these in here. They aren't really detrimental as long as they don't crowd out the native habitat that we're trying to create. And they add actually some species enrichment, diversity in the first couple of years. So now one thing I want to show you, here's another little Canada wild rye coming in here and some wild bergamot. But we also have in this mix common milkweed. Many farmers think of this thing as a useless weed, but what I can tell you is that it's also very useful plant for many insects, including the monarch caterpillar. The monarch butterfly uses this. They lay their eggs on it, and the caterpillars will feed on these leaves, then create a chrysalis and turn into the monarch butterflies. So these milkweeds were planted intentionally in the mix, a close relative of the butterflyweed, but the flowers on these are less showy than on the butterflyweed. But you know the characteristic milkweed pods that it produces. So here we are down a little deeper into that lower spot, and you can see the plants are growing up taller than me. We have some wild bergamot in the background, some of the Canada wild rye, some black-eyed Susan up about maybe 4.5 feet tall. And the insects are going crazy in here. I don't know if you can hear them in the audio, but they're all over here. We have a bumblebee over here. There was a honeybee back here behind me, right back there. Some more honeybees over there. And there are hummingbirds flying everywhere, fighting and chattering all around us. Some more bees over there, but these wild bergamot are really popular right now for the pollinating insects. One thing I'd like to mention is habitat like this can be very isolated from other habitat similar to it. And so connectivity across the landscape, whether it's in your garden or it's in your large plot behind your house or your backyard, that creates connectivity for insects and for wildlife. And so wildlife habitat at any scale is helpful and purposeful and something to consider. So when we talk about the habitat values of a pollinator planting, one of the things we have to talk about is edge. And so you don't want to ignore the edge. You know, our planting was intended for open areas, but there is this really important edge between the forests, shrubby habitat, where many species rely on food and cover. And so in these areas near a pollinator planting, you want to look for shrubby vegetation and also other food sources for wildlife. And so here we have blackberries and raspberries coming in naturally, and this is a good thing. It just further enhances the species diversity, the food and the cover, all of the habitat requirements for wildlife and the biodiversity goals that you have secondary to the pollinator purposes of the habitat. Now we're on the other edge of the pollinator habitat with some agricultural land, some orchard trees in the background. As you all know, many of our foods come from pollination. and we require pollinating of insects in order to have our foods. And so when you think about that, especially in northern Michigan, with all of the fruit trees and the commerce that comes from that, you can see how important it is to have pollinator habitat to help support our honeybees, but also to supplement pollination on orchard sites. And so that's what the purpose of this habitat right here is. Buffered from any agricultural chemicals that might be being used over there, we have nectar and honey throughout the growing season for the insects to be using, as well as the other habitat requirements we talked about. So our mix for this site included about 21 species, and this one here is a relative of the common milkweed. This is butterflyweed, also a host for the monarch caterpillar. You can see it's much more ornamental, very pretty orange flowers. But to have this coming up the first year in this pollinator habitat is really exciting. I see some that are going to seed and will be producing more in the future. And then right next to it here we have a purple coneflower that's just beginning. Surrounded by some other weeds, Hoary Alyssum and some knapweed, but hopefully those won't persist as the habitat increases. We also planted in here some warm season grasses, so we have little bluestem that will fill in from the ground up, and as it closes up the ground cover, hopefully we'll crowd out some of these other weeds that were here in the seed bank. So here we are in a really sandy area of this field, and you will see a couple of the grasses that we planted coming up, little bluestem, and then also a cool season Canada Wild Rye. This one's added in generally just to help stabilize the soil, another native grass, but one that grows in the early spring, whereas these grow midsummer. So you can see the differences in their growth habit. This one here is already gone mature to seed, where these ones are just now flowering and going to seed later in the season. So this one here is Black-Eyed Susan. These are added into the mix, one because they add diversity of wildflowers, but also because they're very showy. Often these first sites, the first couple of years with these sites, they don't have much to show as the native plants take longer to establish, often with a lot of root growth. And so this one's put in as a quick and early showy flower that makes it look as though something's going on while the rest are working on developing their root systems. But you'll see throughout this whole field we have quite a bit of the Black-Eyed Susan, and again, nice to see these coming up the first year, but often these are the only ones that are here, and instead we'll see quite a bit of diversity throughout the field. So a couple more species that aren't as common out here, but we're running across our rosinweed and some of the goldenrods, which should be blooming later in the season. This one in particular, this is the only plant I've seen out here, but many times these take a couple of years to fully establish, so I'm excited to see this added diversity into the pollinator planting so early. And this yellow plant here is Evening-Primrose. This one struggled a little bit. The deer population out here is on the rise, and there's been some deer browse on the primary stems, but you can see it's flowering profusely. In fact, it's a little bit past prime. Many of these flowers are already fading while some of the others are just starting, and that's a really important thing with pollinator habitat, is to have flowering plants throughout the growing season, throughout the entire season, so that there's pollen and nectar for the plants throughout the year, not just at certain times. So in creating a seed mix, it was very important to look at the different colors of the flowers, the different timing of the flowers, and also which ones really are encouraging the native insects and the honeybees the most. So this is one of the less common wildflowers that we planted. This is a native legume, round-headed bush clover, just beginning. In some test plots I have with this plant, it's not performing that well in these sandy soils. So we may find that this site will work better, or it may not do well here either. But the idea here is that you add a legume, a nitrogen fixer, in to add a little diversity to the habitat planting. And so hopefully once they establish, they'll take off and do well. And there's a few more showing up here too. And I hope that there's more than we've found because they're so nondescript right now as little green plants, that hopefully there are more here than I realize, and that they're doing very well and will be part of the pollinator habitat as it goes forward. This habitat was installed as part of the Farmland Pollinator Protection Project. The Conservancy was working in partnership with the American Farmland Trust on a conservation innovation grant designed to do innovative work where we paid landowners to install habitat on protected land that would provide pollination services to the farmland nearby. We've installed 40 acres within our 5 counties. Good portion of that is on Old Mission Peninsula, where quite a bit of the agricultural production of cherries and other orchards are. So we're hoping that that habitat will really support the protection efforts that have already been done on Old Mission Peninsula. Thanks for joining us today on our tour of Pollinator Habitat. If you've been inspired at all and you have any land at all of any size to do this on, there are some cost share programs that could be available to you through some of our partnership programs. For more information about Conservancy programs, please visit our website at www.gtrlc.org. Thanks again.